Evening, everyone, and welcome to this Royal Society of Medicine event as part of our In Conversation live series. I'm Dr Mimi Malhotra, the current Vice President of the Respiratory Council here at the Royal Society of Medicine, and also a newly started academic respiratory registrar based in London. Today, I have the absolute honour of introducing and speaking to someone who is a part of so many of our lives on screen and someone who has shaped British Asian comedy and culture for several decades now. He's a popular actor and writer from hit series Goodness Gracious Me and The Composite Number 42, absolute classics. And more recently, he's been solving crimes in ITV's Unforgotten and has also starred in Sandman, Paddington 2 and many more films. Amidst all of that, he's found time to present documentaries, including one on post-partition India. He topped the charts with a comic relief single, Spirit in the Sky, which is very catchy, and is currently ambassador for the British Asian Trust, Prince's Trust, as well as being a high-profile supporter of Unicef. And with that, I'm absolutely delighted and also very excited to welcome Sanjeev Bhaskar OBE.
Hi, Mimi. Thank you very much. I have to say that Anita Singh on Twitter, Anita the tweeter, did say that I'd achieved the impossible dream, the impossible Asian dream of having a career in the arts and being invited to speak to the Royal Society of Medicine. So thank you for that singularly unique honour.
Yeah, 100%. I saw that. So for the audience's benefit, our plan was to have a free-flowing conversation, just see where it takes us. You've told me and confirmed again today that nothing is off limits, except maybe asking you to stand up for some unknown reason to me. And I'm sure that applies to everyone at home as well. So if you do have any questions, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and we can try and weave them into the conversation. I've also been told that if you thumbs up a question, then it'll get pushed up to the top of the list. So do that if you like someone else's question as well. So to start with, I thought I'd ask you about life before you became a household name. I know you have a degree in marketing, you worked for IBM, again, a prestigious organisation, but you also had a stint in a local London hospital. So just to take you back, how was life before you were an actor?
It feels like a different person slightly. Well, no, it's the same person, but somebody without confidence, I suppose, and someone desperate to fit in. It was quite, it was a nice childhood. I had a nice home and my parents are great. My sister is amazing. And we had a couple of members of family here, and the rest of the family were mostly in India. So we'd go and see them every 4 or 5 years. And it was all kind of fairly standard. I mean, we lived above a laundrette. My father had a laundrette that he ran, as well as working in a factory. And my mother was working in an accounts office. We had no back garden. And so I think a lot of the time I was just left to my imagination. And I think that's where my imagination probably developed. I loved reading. So I was at the library a lot and watched a lot of TV. And my mum says to me that they just thought I was a TV addict. And their punishment for me, actually, because we had one room that was warm enough to live in over the winter. It was like some sort of weird camping festival thing that we were doing, all of us, 4 of us sleeping in one room, which had a gas fire. And so the punishment was that for me, it was to have my back turned to the TV. But unbeknownst to her at that point, I worked out where any reflecting surface was, whether it was a mirror, shiny silver vase, anything like that, so I could carry on watching. So years later, of course, I told my mum that that was all research and that she got it wrong. And then I kind of tried to do the dutiful thing and do the kind of GCSEs and A-levels that my parents wanted me to do, which was obviously medicine, but I just didn't have the aptitude for medicine. And ended up doing a degree. The stint in the hospital actually came later, and that was, I worked in marketing for about 8 years, and the last marketing company I worked for, I sued for breach of contract, and that took about 2 years to go through the courts and before they settled out of court. But during that time, I couldn't get any kind of job at all. So in order to do something, I went to my local hospital, which was West Middlesex Hospital in Twickenham, because I knew they had a hospital radio set up there. and asked if I could be a part of that and volunteer. So I did that for about 2 years, I think. I would go 3 times a week, and initially I'd go around the wards and collect requests, and eventually then presented a show on there.
That's great. And I think we were talking last time that there was also a bit of mistaken identity when you were at that hospital.
Well, yes. I mean, there are probably 2 or 3 incidences in my life where the embarrassment is such a strong sense memory that actually I can feel myself getting hot remembering this one. This is one of them. So on my first day of collecting requests, they sent me around with somebody who'd been there quite a few years. And I said, I don't know what to do. And he said, well, look, we'll both go to a ward. You take one side, I take the other, and we just collect requests. And I said, yeah, but what do I say? I don't know what to say. And he said, well, just be friendly and ask them how they are and how they're feeling. And then, move the conversation around to the hospital radio and what kind of song they'd like. I said, okay. So this is the very first ward we went to, which was obst and gynaes. And I went to the first lady in the first bed, and I said, good evening. How are we feeling today? And she said, well, doctor. And then proceeded to give me way too much detail. And I was so shocked that she'd called me a doctor. She obviously assumed that I was a doctor. And I, other than just saying, oh, I see. When did, I was just thinking, I don't know what to do. And so she carried on with all this detail. And I then said, do you like jazz? And she said, what? I said, Frank Sinatra. I'm thinking, big band, Dean Martin, that sort of thing. At which point she pressed the buzzer and the sister came. And I kind of
Why jazz? Did she just have that kind of face about her at the time?
I don't know, maybe she did. Okay. Maybe she had jazz hands. I don't know when she was explaining her kind of gynae issues, but it was just horrendously embarrassing. It was awful. I kind of then avoided that particular ward for about 7 months.
Yeah, I think very sensible given the circumstance. You don't want to be chased off a ward. But it is interesting because I think a lot of us, especially the junior doctors that may be joining us on the call, actually often get mistaken for anything that isn't the doctor looking after them. So it's nice to know that some people have the look of a doctor. I then wanted to ask, I guess when I was telling my family friends, a few of whom I'm sure are on the call, so hello, thanks for joining us. They all go back to scenes from Goodness Gracious Me and the British Asian comedy that you really put on the map. I guess in hindsight, it's such a classic and it's defined the path for so many of us. But when it first aired, were you worried about how it might have been received? Did you have any criticism? Did people say you were poking too much fun at your own culture, for example?
Yeah, it was interesting, actually. I mean, when you're making something, you really don't have any idea whether it's going to be successful, whether anyone will watch it, what they'll feel about it. I mean, you really don't. And so you just concentrate on making it. And for me, as somebody who wanted to kind of write and act, it was quite an unreal situation. The other 3 regular cast members had all trained or had been working in theatre or in television for a number of years, and so I was really new to it. So I was flying on that, really. I was just enjoying that. But the reaction was interesting when it came out, because there was certainly, we got 2 kind of interesting reactions, I think. One was that I remember there were 6 people who contacted the BBC every week that the show went out, the first series went out, to complain that it was racist against white people. And I thought that was really interesting. And I've always been grateful for them for being such regular viewers and bumping up our numbers. But also the older generation of Asians were slightly kind of nervous about it. And I remember a press call that we did quite early on, and somebody in that said, why are you washing our dirty linen in public? And I said, wouldn't you rather your linen was washed? And he said, yes. And I said, do you have dirty linen at home? And he said, no. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're trying to say. He said, I love the show. And so there was that reaction. I think it was there because there hadn't really been a presence on TV, and certainly not in entertainment to any extent at all. And to suddenly have a lot of Asian characters that were, I don't think we were critical, because I think we did everything with a lot of affection, but that certainly kind of, we sent ourselves up as well, our own attitudes, as well as the attitudes that we were surrounded by, whether it be by race or by age or by, the women. I mean, it was very important that we had the sketch group was 2 males and 2 females, and Mira was a kind of important writer in that, to bring that voice as well. So all of those things I think hadn't happened before. And I think, so I understand the slight kind of nervousness, but in terms of how culturally important it was, it's something that you can only look at in hindsight. It's taken me a long time to be objective enough to kind of see that it perhaps was important in ways that we didn't plan, certainly.
Yeah.
At that time.
And I guess leading on from that, have you reflected on how the industry might have changed since then? Do you think you would have had the same script writing freedom now, for example, or do you think it would have landed as well now?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that when I see the sketches now, I think they've aged quite well, and I think it's because we were sending up attitudes a lot of the time, so which are archetypes. And on the one hand, I think, oh, great, they still seem funny and they still work. And on the other hand, I think, really, have we not moved on in 20 years? That those still feel relevant. So, it's a double-edged sword slightly for me, because one would like to think, attitudes towards, all those things, age, race, and gender would have changed, but I don't think they've spectacularly changed since then. So that's kind of slightly disappointing in a far more existential way. But I think that's why the sketches, I think, still work. I think because they are archetypes and they are attitudes, and you'll kind of always find those attitudes about, fortunately and unfortunately.
And are they still themes that you try and bring into your current work at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of realized that everything I've done, actually, what underpins it has been fighting against a sort of a kind of supposition of who you are, preconception of who you are and what you can do. And so certainly, a lot of the characters that I wrote in Goodness Gracious Me had that at their base. And then when I created the next series, which was The Commands at Number 42, I deliberately made the grandmother as the old Indian woman, the funniest and sharpest character, just to kind of turn that particular preconception on its head. And I was the youngest, and I was male, and I was the dimmest of the family, with one with the biggest ego and stuff. And so I think that has underpinned everything, actually. Indian Doctor, which was another series I did, which was, again, it was how do we explore notions of race other than through conflict? Can we do it through curiosity? And so it's always, I think, with everything I've done, actually. I mean, Sunny Khan is the character that I play in Unforgotten, and I don't think there's been a character quite like him. He's half Muslim and half Hindu, and I'm not sure there's many characters of that kind, although it's not dwelt upon. So I think for me, the preconception of who you are based on what you look like or your name is something I've always kind of has been at the heart of everything I've done.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really interesting, and probably something that a lot of people at home can resonate with as well. I guess on a lighter level, one of the legacies that we used in our social media for this event was chuddies. Some people might not know what that is. And also, I definitely don't know how you get a word added to the Oxford English Dictionary. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a couple of the characters that were created for Goodness Gracious Me were characters that I played and that I'd written beforehand with Nitin Sawhney, who's now a sort of renowned composer. And one of the characters, these were young boys who were street, and at that time they just talked like that the whole time, innit? And I wanted a phrase to kind of say, "Go away," or "I don't believe it," or something like that. And The Simpsons was kind of not long started at that time, and Bart Simpson had a phrase which was "eat my shorts," and I thought, oh, rhythmically that's quite good. I quite like that 3-word thing, and so I came up with "kiss my chuddies," chuddies being underpants, and it was just through the usage of that, and then subsequently it would get used in newspaper articles, etc., that it was then, you know, included in the Oxford English Dictionary. And so it is my claim to fame, isn't it? I mean, how many people can say they've added a word to the Oxford English Dictionary? You can use that word in Scrabble and get points. I mean, it's so yeah, it started off as just something that I thought would be quite funny and in character for those particular characters, those lads. But yeah, it developed into something and then into the dictionary. My mum, when I told her, oh, chuddies has gone into the Oxford English Dictionary because I used it on thingy, she did say, couldn't you have used a better word, a nicer
your
word?
One claim to fame.
Underpants, yeah.
Do you really think that's your proudest moment? I'm sure you've got a few to choose from.
I mean, after that, obviously, having children comes after that, but
Okay.
it's such a unique, bizarre thing. You know, it's and it's not of my choosing. You know, I didn't lobby for
No,
it or
definitely.
anything. It
You
just,
weren't signing a
ended up
petition,
in there.
sharing it around the neighbourhood.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Exactly.
I'm sure lots of people are going to look forward to bringing that out on their Christmas Day Scrabble this year, definitely. So you mentioned how you've played Dr. Prem Sharma, and then currently DI Sunny Khan. But then I think you're also in The Horrible Histories and Paddington and lots of other things. What was your favourite role to play? Or do you think that's still yet to come?
That's very difficult to say, actually, because you know, if you're really lucky, as I have been and am, you get to do a variety of things. And so, in goodness gracious me, playing, you know, 30, 40 characters across the series was just great. And of those, I think there are two that are my favorites. I think one was a guru, one was a mystical Indian guru who knew nothing about Indian mysticism, the Guru Maharishi Yogi. And he was really just out to fleece sort of Westerners, really, out of their money. And that was always great fun to play. And the other one was a vocal thing. Now, there was a program long before you were born, Mimi, called Skippy the Bush Kangaroo, which was an Australian series from the 60s, which was the adventures of a small kangaroo on a base somewhere. I can't remember. He was a ranger, I think, and his family, and the adventures that the boy and Skippy would do. And in goodness gracious me, I wrote and then performed a series of sketches about Skipinder, the Punjabi kangaroo. And it was basically taking lots of clips from those programs and then revoicing, giving Skippy a voice, because in the original he just went like that, and combining that with the existing dialogue that they had in those shows. And it was a little bit like going mad, because it was just me and lots of voices, but that was great fun to do. But you know, the Prem Sharma was just a great part, just as I said, to kind of explore differences in race through curiosity as opposed to conflict, was just felt a new way, not a new way because other people have done it, but it felt a fresh way to go into a series. And you know, the writing on Unforgotten is just unbelievable, and so to be surrounded by writing that's that good and actors that are that good it's hard to kind of fault that as an experience. So it's very difficult for me to choose one.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, Unforgotten, incredible, biggest fan, binge watched the last season. Back to your doctoring days, do you have any fun facts you want to share with a partly medical healthcare professional that you learned when you were learning to be a doctor?
We were interested in the experiences, actually, and I think what was interesting about the research for the Indian doctor was just talking to those doctors who'd come to Britain in the late 50s and early 60s and had ended up in you know, far-flung places in Britain. You know, the National Health Service was relatively new at that point. There was a shortage of doctors, and so a lot of these doctors came and ended up in Welsh villages and things, but very quickly became part of that community. And mostly stayed actually, and that was really interesting. So my great uncle, so my father's uncle, was a Harley Street doctor, a GP, and he was here just post-war, and he was very old school. I mean, it was he always wore a three-piece suit and a bow tie. That was his thing. That was his doctoring clothes. In fact, I think the only difference was, I think it was a bow tie for work, and then when he came to us for dinner or something, he'd just have a normal tie.
I mean, that's perfect. Bow tie is good for infection control. No ties allowed in most hospitals
there
now.
you go. There you go. I
It's
knew there
leading
was
the
something
way.
more to it. And he was fascinating because, you know, he'd come here really early, before the kind of, you know, the more significant waves of immigration from South Asia. So he was there, he was here before that. So there was something about him. There was a kind of stoicism about him. There was certainly an educational aspect to him, which I kind of drew on. But then I spoke to a couple of doctors actually in Wales who had kind of settled in. So there was very little that I had to learn in terms of procedure. I think had I played a surgeon or something, I think I would have had to, for my own sake, I would have had to kind of learn a bit more about it. But in terms of being a GP and the storylines, I didn't have to learn procedure too much, but certainly trying to get under the skin of how these people came to be here. And by here, I mean in small villages in Wales, in this particular instance, was fascinating in terms of the character study.
Yeah. And I guess leading on from that, you did do some work with the BBC documentary, didn't you? India with Sanjeev Bhaskar, which presumably would explore that a bit more as well. How did you find that experience, kind of going back? Was it to your ancestral home, but then with a film crew and kind of trying to be yourself as well?
It was extraordinary, actually, because, you know, I got to see parts of India that I would never have got to see otherwise. And again, my part of the purpose for me at that point was to try to avoid the stereotypical images of India, to kind of go, well, let's look at something else. Incidentally, so there was one guy that I interviewed on that, was it on that particular, might have been an earlier, no, it was an earlier documentary actually. There's a documentary I did for Channel 4, which was the first documentary series I did about the Kama Sutra. And I thought, you know, the famous bit of the Kama Sutra is what everyone knows. Is there more to it? And actually, the famous bit of the Kama Sutra is only about 20% of the book. And I wanted to look at the other 80% as well. And as part of that, I interviewed a guy who said he was India's leading sexologist. And he was a doctor in Mumbai. And he was an amazing guy, and he had a private practice. And then one day a week, he would go to the local municipal hospital and would see people for free. And people would bring their kind of sexual problems to him. And it was fascinating. And he was a great character. He was kind of very old school, tough love, like an old Indian uncle or something in his bedside manner, if you like. There was a lot of, you know, people started crying. You know, there was a lot of him going, "Stop it, hey, stop," which I thought was hilarious. But anyway, as we didn't get this on camera, unfortunately, but as we wrapped up filming and we were leaving, I said to him, I said, just as a matter of interest, I mean, you're a sexologist. What did your parents think when you became a sexologist? And he said to me, he said, for 5 years, I didn't tell them. He said, and then I organized the world's first symposium on the orgasm. And I came home, it was in all the papers. My father was holding the paper like this, saying, "What is this? What is this?" Which I thought was just great. Even though he was a lead, he was a leader in his field, he was still slightly embarrassed by his parents.
I guess as a child of Asian parents, always good to say, well, have you looked at so-and-so? What are they up to? They're in the newspaper for it. I think we've just had a question through in the chat to say, maybe shows my ignorance, but have you written any books? And I think you did write up this experience somewhat, didn't you?
Yeah, the documentary series that I did going around India, I did. That's the only book that I've written so far. And it was a joy to write, actually, because one does the journey and you film bits and you film reactions, but actually there was no time for it to sink in. So particularly retracing my father's steps, He moved at partition, and so retracing his steps from Shimla, where he had his first job, which is in the north, to Delhi, where he was a refugee in a refugee camp, and then across the border into Pakistan and to his ancestral village, and the village he was born in, was an extraordinary thing. And I remember ringing my dad from this village, which really didn't seem to have changed much in 60 years, and saying, gosh, Dad, I'm literally walking in your footsteps. I mean, this is just an extraordinary thing. So allowing time for that to percolate and to gather my thoughts on it was great. And I really did enjoy writing the book, actually.
Yeah. And I guess that is a journey that's really unique, and most of our parents' generations wouldn't have gone back to their ancestral homes in a way that you were able to. How long did you leave between the visit and writing the book?
That's a good question. I can't remember now. I think not very long. I mean, I have an anecdotal memory. So my earliest memory is at 2.5 years old. And I have quite vivid memories of events and things from that point onwards. And I think what made it easy for me to write the book was that so many of those things were self-contained little experiences, and plus photographs and stuff which acted as a prompt. So I don't think it was that long, but a lot of it came back incredibly fresh and vivid. I remember what people said, or what they were wearing, or where they were standing in relation to me, and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't difficult to write, I suppose. It's in terms of recall, certainly, but it all felt quite fresh.
That's great. I mean, a good memory is number one skill for a doctor. Don't give up hope yet, Sanjeev.
That's why I'm here. I mean, I'm keeping my options open. I mean, I need something to fall back on.
I'm sure. When you were in India, were you tempted to make the Bollywood break at all?
It was interesting. I've been to a couple of sets, and I appeared in very, very briefly in one Bollywood film. And my agent got a call through, and he said, "Look, they'd love you to do this one scene in this Bollywood film." And I said, "That's great. Oh my goodness, it'd be fantastic." Bollywood films are known for kind of their locations and all the rest of it. And I said, "Where will we?" Victoria Station in Russia, speaking in Gujarati, which is not a language I speak. So I kind of said to them, "Can you make it Hindi or Punjabi or something?" And they went, "No." And so I just had to learn phonetically the Gujarati to do the scene.
That's great. Well, you were headhunted. That's incredible. Well done.
Oh, it's very flattering. It's flattering to be asked. So it was a good experience. It was quite fun.
Yeah. I think we've had a few comments in the chat box. Have you been approached to play parts in action movies as a British villain or James Bond 007? Very topical right now. Are there any roles you really wanted but didn't get?
As a villain, I mean, what are they going to do? Drop me on James Bond? I think that would be I'd be Ordnance.
5-minute shooting scene. Yeah. Goodbye.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big fan of the Bond films, so to be in a Bond film in whatever capacity would be extraordinary. But no, I haven't been approached. It's interesting with the villain thing, because I'd quite like to play more villains. Villains are great fun to play because they don't have empathy, and so they are totally self-centered. So villains, they're not thinking about anybody else's feelings. They're just doing what they want to do, and that's quite fun to play. It's horrible to be, but great fun to play. So I would leap at the chance of leap not very high unless I kind of do a bit more exercise, but I would leap at the chance of playing a villain in an action film.
That's great. You've got, I mean, big fan club on the call, obviously, but there's calls for you to go to India and do some comedy shows and stand up, which you'll have to take up with.
Oh, well, that's very nice. It's nice that people think I might be capable. So
no, definitely. I was going to move us on a little bit to talk about some of the work you've done perhaps more recently in your roles as ambassador to the Prince's Trust and British Asian Trust, and also being a supporter of UNICEF. I have to admit, I didn't know these were things that you were doing until more recently. How did those roles come about?
Well, the Prince's Trust, I really liked the way they approached helping. It was a hand up rather than a hand out. And they approached me because at that time, this was kind of about 22 years ago, that there was a youth club that they had helped fund in London. And the kids there had asked for me. And so they got in touch and said, look, would you go along and say a few words of encouragement? And I said, yeah, gosh, really? They asked for me? And they said, yeah, they've seen, I guess, goodness gracious me. And so I went along to that. And I was just so impressed with the way it had been set up and the fact that, young people approach the Prince's Trust to help them. So the fact that they are proactive in that, it's not the charity going out looking for people. People come to the charity, and it's such a huge and important step that someone takes. And then to have an organization that would then respond to them and help them and partner with them to develop whatever it was they wanted to do, a business idea or whatever, I thought was just fantastic. And so I was very eager to be more involved, and I got more involved in that. And then after a few years, I think it was that I had a message that the Prince of Wales, who's got a long-standing affection for the subcontinent, wanted to create a trust that partnered, people who'd done well in business here with projects in India that could do with some help. And so I was brought in quite early on to be asked. There were about 5 of us around a table, and we were asked whether we thought it was a good idea, or how would we approach it. Or so there was part of that shaping committee I was a part of, and it was an extraordinary thing. So there are many kinds of projects, but there was one project that I went to, which I filmed at actually for the documentary series as well, where they would, in Rajasthan, where they would take people who were illiterate, the focus being on women as well, to make them economically independent, but turn them into solar engineers. And it was that, these people can't read and they can't, therefore pass formal exams, but they can watch and learn. And that's what they were doing. So, these people would come in, they would watch the engineer, they would work with the engineer until they just knew what to do. And it was projects like that I thought were absolutely extraordinary. So I was very happy to be a part of that as well. And with UNICEF, so one of my big heroes growing up was the actor Roger Moore. And he was the first James Bond I went to see at the cinema. And when I was a kid, there used to be a series called The Saint, which we all used to watch as a family. And I was kind of besotted by Roger Moore. And then I got to meet him and eventually even, became friends with him as well. And he was, a sort of, UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, and for a very long time as well. And he would talk about UNICEF and, the fact that it was focused on children and mothers and families around the world. And so when UNICEF approached me and said, would you come to one of our projects? I kind of said, absolutely. I've been wanting to get involved ever since Roger Moore first mentioned it. And so I've only done one trip abroad with them, which was to Malawi, where they opened a sort of day and weekend play centers, really, for children who really don't have access to that kind of thing at all. A lot of the children couldn't go to school. So they go to this thing for 2 hours in a day where there are classes and they can be taught, but also they can just be children. Because for a lot of them, that childhood is robbed very, very early. And I met 3 extraordinary boys in the documentary who were, the eldest was 13, I think, and his brothers were sort of 11 and 8. And both the parents were missing, and he had been raising his younger siblings. And so he couldn't go to school as often as he could, and he had to just do labor work or anything he could get to feed them. It was terribly moving, and also just a reminder of how young duty, but particularly compassion, can start. I saw it in India as well. There was a school, the Loreto school I went to in Calcutta, which was run by nuns, and there were a lot of street children who came in. So the fee-paying kids subsidized the street children. And I remember seeing again, it was 3 girls actually, and the girl was about 7, and her younger sister was 5, and the youngest one was 3. And you know, the 3-year-old was just playing, and the other 2 were studying, sitting on the floor. And they had this great simple idea, which was, you know, these kids who may have a very challenging and complex relationship with adults, why don't we just get other children to teach them? So it was, you know, the 10-year-olds who were teaching these 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds who were off the street. And I said, well, what's going on there? That youngest one is only 3. And they said, yeah, they were brought to us when the youngest was only 18 months, didn't know what happened to the parents. And I mean, it still kind of chokes me up to think about it now, but, you know, the fact was that her older siblings would have only been 5, 7, something like that. But the ingrained, you know, notion of looking after the youngest one in particular was so moving while they were studying and stuff like that. So anything like that, you know, I'm sort of down for it, you know, if I can bring notice to it or encouragement to it or anything like that. I mean, that's the easy bit.
That's great insight, and thanks for sharing that with us. Really, really good work. I guess linked to some ambassadorial roles or advocacy work that you've been doing is kind of maybe the politics of things as well, and how you use your platform to lobby other people, and whether or not you do get yourself into controversial situations. I know social media is a big topic at the moment. How have you found the adjustment to social media during your career?
It's a tricky one because, you know, everything you say or don't say gets politicized. And so, you know, I try not to make comment on something that I don't know enough about. And sometimes that's not enough for people, and they're frustrated because there's a lot of wanting people to take sides in things. And I'm happy to take a side if I kind of know what the background to it is and can sit on it a bit until you know, there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions to things, and I'm just not like that. And so I think with social media, certainly, I've just tried to be honest. I mean, I try to, and have tried always, to live a compassion first sort of ethos. And, you know, it's very easy to leap to judgment on people, and you don't know what their path is, you don't know what their journey is, and you don't know what's brought them to a particular opinion. And for me, it's sometimes important to know that, because that journey can be incredibly revealing. And also it seems that, you know, I'm with the people who are looking for common ground, because ultimately, you know, I find sometimes there's no choice, but I do find kind of conflict uncomfortable. And as I said, sometimes there's no choice, and that's a path that you have to take, or one can choose to take. But a lot of the time, I think, why isn't everybody just stepping back from this? And particularly with social media, there's a lot of anonymity. There's not as much, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, there are no repercussions, and so there's very little accountability. And I think there does need to be accountability. I think that, you know, putting up an anonymous, you know, incredibly strong and maybe, you know, deeply felt opinion on social media is fine, but then you've got to kind of accept responsibility for it. And in a way, being anonymous, you kind of don't. And so, because I'm older, and, you know, I remember a time before social media, and before mobile phones and all that sort of stuff, you know, it's an incredible connectivity tool, but also, as everybody has seen, it can be an incredibly destructive tool as well. And I read a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson, who's one of my favorite writers. And he talked about that pylon and where it can lead. And so, not that I was particularly, you know, pylon type person beforehand, but that certainly kind of clarified for me, certainly, the need to just step back sometimes and just take stock a little bit, and to be kind, you know, even to people whose opinions I don't necessarily share.
Yeah. You mentioned anonymity. Do you ever wish you were anonymous, or have you ever wished that?
Yeah, well, I think I was anonymous. Yeah, in a way. I mean, I'll tell you what, there was a really kind of clear moment for me, which was, so when I was a kid and, you know, I was brought up in West London and not very far from Heathrow Airport. And I had quite a torrid time at school, and there was lots of intimidation and bullying, and you know, there was a period of time when everyone stopped talking to me, and you know, there was a lot of peer pressure of that kind. But what I always loved doing actually was going to Heathrow Airport for the day, and I'd get a sandwich and I'd get a drink, and I would sort of move between the arrivals hall and the departure hall, and I would just watch people, because it seemed to me that the purest drama was happening in front of me all the time. You know, that pain of separation. You'd see the people, you know, disappear off, you know, towards customs or whatever, and a baggage check, not baggage check, security checks and stuff. And you'd see the family that was left. And it was always a really interesting thing to see. You know, it was genuine emotion. And similarly with Arrival, where people would be much more excited and they'd be up, and then, you know, their relative or friend or whatever would suddenly come into view. You know, they'd be straining to see them, then they'd see them, and some people had to run forward. And it was beautiful, but it was pure. And I loved watching all of that. And I can't remember where I'd gone. I flew back into Heathrow and came out in the arrivals hall, and 3 people wanted pictures or an autograph. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I've just gone from the observer to the observed. I can't be anonymous anymore. And that was kind of quite a moment for me. And so, yeah, one still can, you know, you can go to another country.
Camouflage.
It's kind of, yeah. Well, the problem was, I thought any disguise I thought of going out in, I dressed up in goodness gracious me. There was nothing that I hadn't dressed up as. So yeah, the anonymity thing, yeah, I think so sometimes, but it's, you know, generally people are very nice to me. And so I understand that excitement of seeing someone, you know, that's on the telly or in a film or something that you've liked, and wanting to make contact. You know, I get that.
Yeah.
That's their moment. And sort of 99% of the time, I think I'm quite amiable towards it. A couple of times when, there was one time when I had kidney stones, and it was excruciating pain. I mean, just excruciating. And I ended up going for an X-ray, and the person who was taking the X-ray, so I'm lying, you know, on this table, and as the lady was taking my X-ray, she said, I'm such a big fan. Could I get a picture? And I said, well, you're taking one now, so just sign that. So that was a moment where kind of anonymity might have been preferable.
But the comedy came through, which is great. You
Yeah.
mentioned dress up. Do you have a favorite costume from over the years?
Favorite costume? Gosh, that's a good question. I've not been asked that before. That's a tricky one, actually. I'm trying to think of, I don't think I've ever worn anything really fancy.
Really? Comic relief? Single? That was one of my favorites anyway.
Gosh.
Let's leave it at
Do you know what?
maybe.
You're right. There's nothing fancier than that. It was a gold colored lame suit. I had a wig with a huge quiff on it. That was really good fun, actually. That was good fun to dress up like that, because the gold lame suit was actually an Elvis Presley suit that was on one of his, I think, his second or third album. And so it was a great shorthand for that. Actually, yeah, that was an extraordinary experience as well, to kind of end up on top of the pops and being number one. I mean, you can't plan for that. It was just completely out of the blue. I was on the same show, as far as I remember, with Coldplay. Coldplay were on, and I went to find Chris Martin. This is at Top of the Pops. We were number one, and I went to find him just to kind of say, I'm just really sorry. Like, you're a proper musician, and this is your job, but this is for charity, and I hope you don't mind. And he was incredibly gracious about it. But I remember being on the stage at Top of the Pops and thinking, I'm 40 years old. What am I doing here? And then looking at all these people who are dancing and thinking, who let all these kids in? Yeah, what a bonkers kind of experience that was.
That's great. I mean, fascinating insight. We have so many questions that have come through, and I've just realized I've been completely neglecting them. This could go on for hours, but in the interest of time, I think our number one voted is actually back a bit of a serious one. How do you think representation of South Asians has changed in the media since you first began? And to what degree does media reflect society? Great question.
That is a really good question. I think that it's certainly there was, for South Asians, I don't think there was much representation at all on TV. I think there was the odd program. And I remember this is attributed to Mira, really, who's, just generally smarter than me and more talented. And it was that there was a cycle of things. So initially, when you had people of color characters, it was very tied to a stereotype. Again, the perceived preconception of who they were. And so, Asian characters, were in shops, and it was that sort of stuff. You were a black character, then Afro-Caribbean character, then there was going to be trouble with the police at some stage. It was very much based on that. And then after a while, it moved to more worthy characters. So suddenly, people of color were doctors and care workers and things like that, but never necessarily the leads or the people who drove the plot. And that's certainly something that has changed in the last few years. But to my take on representation, right, and diversity has always been the same. It's not really changed, which is that diversity is should be a much more broad term. And whether it's about color, or whether it's about race, or whether it's about, in this country, regional, or whether it's age or something, all of those things represent a form of diversity. And all of those things are so fundamentally important to a society, because they just bring diversity of thought. It just brings a different experience, a different angle. And ultimately, the key, I think, one of the keys to a society is to be able to problem solve together. And it's very difficult to do that if within that society, as inevitably it will be, but within that society, there is a deep sense of the other. And so the other can be because of the way you look, or your name, or because of your gender, or because you're old or too young, or because you're from Newcastle or from Scotland, or, all those things just become the other. And, because I think of the way that I was brought up and what I was interested in, our stories thing for me were never limited to, what I looked like or where my parents were from. And so I think that's, for me, the key in terms of diversity and in terms of representation as well. It's that it's something I said at graduation at Sussex, which is that I feel really lucky that I have met complete twonks and idiots from every age group and every religion and every gender and every belief and every political affiliation, every country, every city. I mean, in my own family. And so equally, I've met extraordinary people who cover all those things as well. And so that notion of, who has the moral high ground, it just didn't exist with me, because there's idiots and amazing people in every one of those groups. So in terms of representation, I think that it is important to have that. In terms of, does television particularly reflect society? I don't think it necessarily does. I remember saying to a TV conference years ago that if you were setting anything that was contemporary in a British town and you didn't put that diversity in, then that has to be deliberate. I mean, it's kind of because it's there, it exists. We all see it, we all experience it. And again, that thing about finding common ground. It's emotions are emotions, and good storytelling is good storytelling. And we will not. The biggest show in the world on Netflix at the moment is Squid Game, right? Which is a South Korean subtitled show about a kind of Hunger Gamesy type thing. It's the biggest show in the world. Now, in what capacity is the rest of the world saying, well, those are my people. Yeah, those are my stories. It's a, thrilling story, incredibly well told. And, that's the advantage of, having diversity and representation within one community or one country, is that we have access to all of that. And if we don't make the best use of that, then we're missing a trick.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it's how do you use the stereotypes, but also how do you balance them to kind of represent society wholly? I know we're running out of time, but you mentioned.
Sorry, just on the tail end of that, the way that happens is that you have people of diverse backgrounds in positions that have genuine influence. So there you go. That's just
no, thank you. We had a question about racism within the medical profession and how this has kind of come to the forefront potentially more with the COVID pandemic, both towards clinicians and patients. And we've just a question about whether or not you have any thoughts on how us as healthcare professionals might be able to move forward from that. I know you've touched on the kind of kind and compassionate in everything you do, understanding where people come from, but is there anything else you would say in response to that?
I don't think I would know specifically enough, but I think, I'm really surprised whenever there is grief given to health professionals, particularly given the last year and a half, and I find that extraordinary. It's based on extraordinary ignorance and extraordinary meanness of character to be having a go at anybody in the health profession as a general group. I mean, that's so, gosh, how does one deal with it? I mean, the fundamentally important thing is to talk about it. I think that, whether, particularly if you're a health professional, the kind of pressures that you have been under in the last couple of years, I think is unimaginable. The shift and the stress and, the stress of kind of just doing a job, but on top of that, the expectations. I know that for some doctors, the Thursday night clapping and the notion that everyone regarded them as superheroes was extra pressure. And so it's really important, I think, for people within the health, care community to talk about it. I mean, I know, traditionally it has been told that the doctors make the worst patients, but I think it is really important, because also I think when particularly under pressure and feeling harassed and feeling stressed, we lose perspective. I mean, when we're extremely angry, extremely upset, we lose perspective, and it's very difficult on your own, in your own head, to create a perspective. And the simplest way, the most efficient way, is to talk to someone and know that, that feeling of abject isolation that you feel when you're feeling those things isn't unique to you. I think so. Yeah, in a long-winded way, it's talk about it.
Yeah, and I think in your Desert Island Disc episode as well, you kind of share some personal reflections on how talking helped you, if I remember correctly. Maybe.
Yeah, it has. And I kind of, so when I first started acting and writing, the thing I wanted to do since I was 7, and it took me, 30 years to get there, and then seemingly happened very, very quickly. I did find it difficult to deal with, because I grew up with an inherent sense of failure. And so for the first 5 years, when I did, goodness gracious me, and I did a documentary series, and I did a play in the West End, and I appeared in a couple of films, little bits in films. It's everything I wanted to do, but I still felt like a failure. And I remember then finding a therapist, and just to pose the question. I didn't feel like I was, not being able to handle it, but I just went to this therapist and said, I think I should be happier, and I don't understand why not, because I've got all of this around me. Is there something I'm missing? And I think in the same way that, if something goes wrong with your car, you take it to a mechanic. I think that with something like that, I didn't wait to a point that I felt that was the end of something, or I was on the edge of something. It was way before that, but I accessed it early, and it helped incredibly, because again, it was just somebody to talk to, somebody, who's got experience in this area, who can provide perspective and ask the questions that, a friend, however well-meaning, may not ask you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Perhaps not linked to happiness, but I know lots of medics kind of talk about imposter syndrome and not really feeling like you deserve the opportunities you're getting, or that you're doing what you should be doing, especially in light of COVID. My last question, as chair's privilege, I actually wanted to turn to your wife, the wonderful Mira Sayal. I think
Indeed.
many a friend would blame me if I didn't use this opportunity to mention her. But specifically, I thought I'd ask, a lot of medics, healthcare professionals end up marrying one another. How have you both survived being such incredible actors? Has there been competition, rivalry? How have you balanced your work life together?
Well, as I mentioned before, she is, way more talented and way more gifted and way more intelligent and way more eloquent than I am. And I do have to say that for legal reasons. But having said that, I think that, there's always, I think within any kind of relationship, there's a you and there's the other person, and then there's an us. And we've always been very clear about how important the us is, and at that point then we're a team. And I think our attitude to problem solving, go back to that, is really healthy. It complements each other. We talk about things a lot, we talk about things early. One of the things that's very easy to happen in an argument is that it's very easy to shift from the thing that's troubling you or that's bothering you into just the politics of argument. It's like the sort of examples that come to mind are, when someone says, well, that's not what you said. And the person says, well, I meant to say this. Yeah, but that's not what you said, though. It must have been what you meant. And suddenly you're not talking about the issue anymore. You're not resolving that thing anymore. Now you're arguing about the semantics, and that's just about releasing of tension and stuff within an argument. So we never have any discussion where we're trying to win. Any of our discussions and debates and disagreements are there to be resolved. And so the person both people are just kind of trying to get clarity. And, we want to always get back to the point where we're happiest, which is kind of having fun. And so what's the shortest route back to that, by resolving something? So I think that's been a key to it. Irony, having a sense of humor, I think has been a great defense for both of us, because the thing about irony is that it's the one thing that can give you instant perspective. So, we can all agree that this is a mug and it's got the Beatles on it, and we can argue about the shape on it. But, if I look at it from a different angle, from the top, it looks completely different to what I was looking at before. And irony allows you to do that. So even if something is hurtful or painful or something, in my head, I was always able to spin it out into something ridiculous and see it from another view. And suddenly it wasn't just a horrible thing anymore. It was horrible and actually quite funny in a different way. And suddenly you've just got perspective. And that's sometimes just enough to kind of stop you from losing kind of, the context completely. So I think we both have that. And so, yeah, I think we operate as a team. I think we have a very similar sense of humor. But problem solving, I think, is probably key to it. And me legally acknowledging that she is more intelligent and smarter and more gifted and talented than me.
That's perfect. I'm glad we have that on record. And presumably you don't end fights by just throwing in the word chuddies there somewhere.
Not anymore.
No,
Not
great.
anymore.
I think with that, I actually have to draw the conversation to a close before both of us probably get told off or cut off. Thank you so, so much for coming here to be with us this evening and for sharing the insights. Time's flown by. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure our viewers at home have as well. Really sorry to those of you that joined who posted questions but we were unable to get to. Hopefully Sanjeev can answer them at some point in the future. I'm sure you've got many more appearances coming up. Before I say a few last minute RSM announcements, Sanjeev, was there anything you wanted to say to our viewers at home?
Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to kind of join in, and I hope it wasn't too dull and boring for you. And thank you to you, Mimi, and to the RSM for, as Anita Singh pointed out, was the impossible dream of somebody being in the arts and being invited to speak to the Royal Society of Medicine. Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and the time
Yeah.
really has flown.
Thank you for taking us on a roller coaster. Lots of laughs, but also lots of really interesting and deep, meaningful reflections, I think. So before we say goodnight to everyone else, a few messages on behalf of the RSM. So as some of you may be aware, the Royal Society of Medicine is a charity. And so if you're able to and would like to contribute to our educational mission, then please donate. I think this details should pop up on your screen right now. We're also really lucky to be hosting these weekly In Conversation live series as a mix of virtual and in-person events due to be starting soon. Our next In Conversation live is with Peter Cardwell, a political journalist, so do look out for that. On the 23rd of November, we also have former Chief Medical Officer Dame Sally Davies joining the RSM for a spotlight on antimicrobial resistance. So these events and many more are available on the RSM website and other channels. So do join us then. And thanks again for joining. This recording will also be available on the Royal Society of Medicine YouTube channel. So if you have any fans, friends, family that might enjoy it, then do tell them to look out for it as well. Thank you and good evening.